Before Ed Sullivan died, he revealed something shocking that he had kept hidden for decades. America's most powerful TV host finally admitted which singers he truly hated. For 23 years, Sullivan's Sunday night variety show was the most important gateway to fame in America. If you wanted to become a star, you had to get past Sullivan first. Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and the Supremes all needed his approval to reach true stardom. But behind Sullivan's stiff, serious personality were secret grudges and bitter fights that he carefully hid from his 30 million weekly viewers. He seemed to support these performers on camera, but off-camera, his feelings were completely different. Sullivan kept a personal blacklist of performers who had pushed him too far with their rebellious attitudes and defiant behavior. These weren't just business disagreements. They were deeply personal fights that Sullivan carried with him until he died. What made these particular artists trigger such intense hatred from TV's most powerful man? And why did Sullivan wait until his final days to reveal the truth? Elvis Presley, from Never on My Show to reluctant success. In the mid-1950s, Ed Sullivan made a bold statement that would soon embarrass him. He declared that Elvis Presley would never, absolutely never, appear on his program. Sullivan wasn't just doubtful about the young singer from Memphis. He was genuinely horrified by him. After watching Elvis perform on Milton Berle's show in June 1956, complete with suggestive hip movements and grinding motions, Sullivan said the act was unfit for family viewing. Newspapers quoted him saying Presley's vulgar performances were a disgrace to American entertainment. But America wasn't listening to Sullivan's moral judgment. They were too busy falling in love with Elvis. When Elvis appeared on Steve Allen's show in July 1956, he drew massive ratings that crushed Sullivan's numbers for the night. Suddenly, Sullivan's principled stand became very expensive. His producer approached him with a sobering reality. They couldn't afford to keep Elvis off their stage anymore. For a man obsessed with winning the ratings war, this created an impossible choice. Should he maintain his moral stance and watch his viewership drop, or swallow his pride and book an act he personally found disgusting? Money won. In a stunning reversal, Sullivan offered Elvis an unprecedented $50,000 for 3 appearances, the highest fee ever paid to a performer on the show at that time. But even in surrender, Sullivan couldn't resist asserting control. He insisted that the cameras would only show Elvis from the waist up during his more energetic numbers. No hip movements would make it into America's living rooms on his watch. When Elvis made his debut on September 9, 1956, a staggering 60 million viewers tuned in, 82.6% of the television audience. Sullivan wasn't even present for this historic broadcast, having been injured in a car accident. By Elvis's third appearance in January 1957, Sullivan seemed to have warmed slightly to the young star. After Presley's final song, Sullivan surprised everyone by telling the audience that Elvis was a real, decent, fine boy. But behind the scenes, Sullivan's true feelings never changed. He viewed Elvis as a necessary evil, a ratings machine he had to tolerate despite personal disgust. In private conversations with staff and friends, Sullivan continued to express disdain for Elvis's style, his influence on youth, and what he considered the degradation of entertainment standards. For a man accustomed to dictating America's entertainment tastes, being forced to embrace someone he personally detested represented a humiliating defeat. Buddy Holly, the showdown over Oh Boy. By January 1958, 21-year-old Buddy Holly was quickly becoming one of rock and roll's brightest stars. With his distinctive singing style, thick-rimmed glasses, and hits like Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day, Holly represented the fresh, innovative spirit of early rock. When he and his band, the Crickets, were invited to perform on The Ed Sullivan Show, it should have been a career-defining moment. Instead, it became a clash that would forever damage the relationship between the young rocker and television's most powerful host. The trouble began during rehearsals. Holly and the Crickets planned to perform their latest hit, Oh Boy, an upbeat rock number that had teenagers across America dancing in their bedrooms. But Sullivan took immediate issue with the song, particularly lyrics he deemed too suggestive. For Sullivan, a conservative Catholic deeply concerned with maintaining his show's family-friendly image, these lines crossed a line. He demanded that Holly substitute Oh Boy with a different, less provocative song from their repertoire. Holly's response shocked Sullivan's staff. He told them what songs they were going to do, and they were doing "Oh Boy." For a young performer to directly challenge Sullivan was almost unheard of. Most artists, especially those early in their careers, would quickly give in to the host's demands, rather than risk losing such valuable national exposure. But Buddy Holly wasn't most artists. With quiet confidence, he stood his ground. Sullivan, accustomed to complete control over his program, was furious. According to witnesses, his face reddened and his already stiff demeanor became positively icy. From that moment, the tension backstage was obvious. As showtime approached, Sullivan's treatment of Holly grew increasingly cold. He deliberately mispronounced Holly's name during rehearsals, despite multiple corrections. When introducing the Crickets on air, he gave them perhaps the most lifeless, unenthusiastic introduction in the show's history. More vindictively, Sullivan allegedly ordered his sound engineers to lower the volume on Holly's microphone during the performance, a petty attempt to sabotage the song he had tried to prevent. Despite these obstacles, Holly delivered a spirited rendition of "Oh Boy" on January 26, 1958. Though hampered by technical issues, his charisma and the song's infectious energy still connected with audiences. After the performance, Sullivan's final insult was a half-hearted handshake and quick dismissal. No invitation to return was extended, which was unusual for a performer of Holly's caliber. The conflict might seem minor by today's standards, but in 1958, crossing Ed Sullivan meant risking your entire career. Holly's willingness to stand up to television's most powerful gatekeeper revealed not just his integrity, but also the changing dynamics in American entertainment. Tragically, Holly would have little time to enjoy his victory. Almost exactly 1 year after his Sullivan appearance on February 3, 1959, he died in a plane crash at just 22 years old, a loss that would later be called the day the music died. Bob Dylan, the censorship that made him walk. By 1963, 21-year-old Bob Dylan was rapidly emerging as the poetic voice of a new generation. His lyrics, dense with literary references, political commentary, and social criticism, were elevating folk music from simple protest songs to complex artistic statements. When Dylan was invited to perform on The Ed Sullivan Show in May 1963, it represented an opportunity to bring his thought-provoking music to a mainstream audience of millions. He chose to perform Talking John Birch Paranoid Blues, a satirical song that mocked the extreme anti-communist paranoia of the Joes in Birch Society, a far-right group that saw communist conspiracies everywhere. In the song's narrative, the paranoid narrator searches for communists under his bed, investigates his local library for communist literature, and eventually begins to suspect everyone around him. The humor was biting but clear. Dylan was ridiculing the irrational fear that had gripped parts of America during the McCarthy era. During Saturday's rehearsal, Dylan performed the song without incident. Ed Sullivan himself was present and reportedly found the clever lyrics amusing, giving the performance his approval. Everything seemed set for Sunday's broadcast. Then, CBS executives stepped in. Just hours before the live broadcast, a network lawyer approached Dylan with an ultimatum: change the lyrics or choose a different song entirely. The concern wasn't artistic, but legal. They feared potential lawsuits from the actual John Birch Society, even though the song was clearly satirical. For Dylan, this represented a fundamental issue of artistic integrity. The song's political commentary was its entire purpose. Watering it down or substituting another track would undermine the very reason he'd agreed to appear. His response was immediate and clear. If he couldn't play his song, he wasn't going to appear on the show. And with that, Dylan walked out of the studio, turning his back on television's biggest platform and the millions of viewers it would have brought him. News of Dylan's walkout spread quickly through the music industry and press. Rather than harming his career, the incident enhanced his credibility as an uncompromising artist unwilling to dilute his message for commercial gain. At a time when the civil rights movement was gaining momentum and America's involvement in Vietnam was beginning to escalate, Dylan's stand against censorship resonated powerfully with young people increasingly skeptical of authority. For Sullivan, Dylan's departure created an awkward hole in the program and a public relations challenge. The show released a statement characterizing the incident as a misunderstanding rather than censorship, but few were convinced. The clash highlighted the widening cultural gap between television's conservative gatekeepers and the more politically charged, boundary-pushing artists emerging in the 1960s. James Brown, too hot for Sullivan's America. If Ed Sullivan represented the controlled, sanitized face of American entertainment, James Brown embodied its uninhibited soul. Known as the hardest-working man in show business, Brown delivered performances of such staggering intensity that they bordered on religious experience. Drenched in sweat, dropping to his knees, screaming with gospel fervor, and executing dance moves of astonishing athleticism, Brown transformed stages into theaters of emotional release. For Sullivan, a man who valued restraint, predictability, and proper behavior, Brown's explosive performance style represented everything uncomfortable about the changing face of American entertainment in the 1960s. While Sullivan had featured black performers on his show since its beginning, he generally preferred those who presented a more polished, controlled stage presence. Artists like Nat King Cole, Lena Horne, and the Supremes, whose elegant performances reassured rather than challenged white middle-class viewers. James Brown was different. His raw emotional intensity, his unapologetically black musical style, and his electrifying physicality made Sullivan visibly uncomfortable. Backstage, Sullivan reportedly expressed concern about Brown's excessive movements and overly emotional delivery, code words for performance elements that white audiences might find too aggressive or sexually charged. When Brown did appear on The Sullivan Show, producers attempted to control his natural performance style. They requested that he avoid his signature moves like full splits, limit his interaction with the audience, and generally tone down the intensity that made him a sensation in the first place. For a lesser artist, these restrictions might have resulted in a weak, forgettable performance. But James Brown's star power was too strong to contain completely. Even a restrained James Brown radiated more energy and soul than most performers at full power. Viewers who saw Brown on Sullivan got only a glimpse of his true abilities, but that glimpse was enough to make an unforgettable impression. For many white Americans, it was their first exposure to the raw emotional intensity of soul music in its purest form. Sullivan's discomfort with Brown's performances reflected more than personal taste. It revealed the racial and cultural tensions of a changing America. As the civil rights movement gained momentum and black artists increasingly refused to water down their cultural expression for white comfort, Sullivan found himself caught between his traditional values and the undeniable power of performers like Brown. Though Sullivan never banned Brown completely, he kept the soul legend on a short leash, limiting his appearances and carefully managing how he was presented. It was a strategy that revealed Sullivan's awareness of Brown's drawing power alongside his discomfort with what Brown represented. The unfiltered expression of black American experience that wouldn't be contained by white expectations. The Beatles, from Sullivan's saviors to cultural enemies. On February 9, 1964, Ed Sullivan extended his arm and said the now famous words, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles." In that moment, American culture shifted dramatically. Over 73 million viewers, roughly 34% of the American population, watched as four young men from Liverpool performed 5 songs and changed music history forever. Sullivan's relationship with the Beatles began as a mutually beneficial partnership. In late 1963, while passing through London's airport, he witnessed firsthand the hysteria surrounding the band as screaming fans mobbed the terminal. Recognizing a potential sensation, Sullivan moved quickly to book them, offering $10,000 for 3 appearances. The investment paid off spectacularly. Their Sullivan debut shattered viewing records and kicked off Beatlemania in America. For Sullivan, the Beatles initially represented a triumphant booking and a ratings goldmine. But behind Sullivan's wooden smile lurked reservations. He reportedly found their shaggy haircuts ridiculous and their cheeky, irreverent humor during rehearsals unsettling. The screaming crowds of teenage girls disturbed him, reminiscent of the Elvis phenomenon he had reluctantly embraced years earlier. Still, business was business. The Beatles were ratings gold, and Sullivan was nothing if not a practical showman. He tolerated their growing influence while privately expressing concerns about their effect on American youth. The real tension emerged as the Beatles evolved. By 1966, they had transformed from the cheerful performers who sang "I Want to Hold Your Hand" into sophisticated artists exploring psychedelic music, Eastern mysticism, and increasingly pointed social commentary. John Lennon's controversial remark that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus horrified Sullivan, a devout Catholic who saw the comment as blasphemous. Their later albums featured drug references, experimental sounds, and counterculture themes that clashed with Sullivan's conservative worldview. As the band stopped touring and focused on studio work, their appearances on Sullivan's show became limited to pre-recorded video performances, a format Sullivan deeply disliked. The final break came in 1968 to 1969, as the Beatles' appearance, music, and politics moved firmly into counterculture territory. Their support for anti-war protests, open discussion of drug use, and John Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono all represented values opposed to Sullivan's traditional beliefs. By the time the Beatles performed via video on Sullivan's show in 1968, the cultural gap between the band and their initial American platform had become unbridgeable. Sullivan, who had once proudly introduced them to America, now privately expressed dismay at their influence. "They're not the nice boys they were," Sullivan reportedly told his producer. "This isn't what our audience wants to see." The Beatles never appeared on The Sullivan Show again after 1968. Their absence marked a symbolic end to an era. For Sullivan, the Beatles represented a personal betrayal. He had given them their American platform only to watch them use their influence to champion values he opposed. The Doors, Morrison's deliberate defiance. On September 17, 1967, the Doors were scheduled to perform their hit, "Light My Fire," on The Ed Sullivan Show. For the young Los Angeles band, it was a crucial opportunity to reach a national audience. Like all acts appearing on the show, the Doors received specific instructions about their performance. Sullivan's producers were particularly concerned about one line in "Light My Fire." The phrase "couldn't get much higher." In the context of 1967, with psychedelic drug culture spreading through rock music, the word "higher" carried obvious drug references that Sullivan found unacceptable for his family audience. Before the show, a producer approached the band with a non-negotiable demand: change "higher" to "better." During rehearsal, the band verbally agreed, apparently willing to make this small compromise for such valuable exposure. What happened next, has become one of the most legendary acts of defiance in rock history. As the cameras rolled and the Doors launched into their performance, lead singer Jim Morrison, with a subtle smile, sang the original lyrics, including "Couldn't get much higher." It was a deliberate, calculated act of rebellion. Morrison hadn't forgotten the instruction or made a mistake. He had chosen to directly defy Sullivan's authority on live national television. When the performance ended, the consequences were immediate. A furious Sullivan refused to shake the band's hands, breaking his customary gesture with performers. A producer stormed backstage, confronting the band. "You'll never play the Ed Sullivan Show again." Guitarist Robbie Krieger recalls Morrison's casual response, "We just did the Ed Sullivan Show." For Sullivan, Morrison's defiance represented more than a simple lyric change. It was a public challenge to his authority as television's cultural gatekeeper. In an era when most performers would do anything to secure a spot on his show, Morrison had treated the opportunity with contempt. True to the producer's word, the Doors were never invited back. Sullivan personally added them to his blacklist of banned performers. The incident perfectly captured the growing cultural divide of the late 1960s. Sullivan, born in 1901, represented pre-war American values of respect for authority and family-friendly entertainment. Morrison, 65 years younger, embodied the counterculture's rejection of those very values, the last guardian of old America. Ed Sullivan's conflicts with these six performers weren't just professional disagreements or personality clashes. They represented a fundamental cultural battle taking place in America during the 1950s and 1960s. Born in 1901, Sullivan came of age in a world of controlled, traditional entertainment. His show, which premiered in 1948, initially reflected those sensibilities. But as his two-decade reign as television's most powerful tastemaker progressed, America transformed around him. The post-war baby boom created a massive youth market with different tastes and values. Rock and roll emerged as not just a musical style, but a cultural force challenging traditional notions of propriety and authority. Sullivan recognized the commercial potential of these new performers. His business instincts were always sharp. but he never fully embraced the cultural changes they represented. Each booking of an Elvis or Beatles came with attempts to contain, control, and sanitize their more provocative elements. His personal blacklist offers a fascinating window into this cultural struggle. The 6 performers who earned his deepest hatred weren't necessarily the most controversial acts of their era, but they were the ones who most directly challenged Sullivan's authority or values. Elvis forced Sullivan to compromise his standards for ratings. Buddy Holly refused to change his song when ordered to. Bob Dylan walked away, rather than allow his political message to be censored. James Brown's raw emotional intensity defied Sullivan's preference for contained, polite performances. The Beatles evolved from clean-cut pop sensations into counterculture icons, and Jim Morrison deliberately flouted Sullivan's rules on live television. By the late 1960s, Sullivan's influence was declining. His show remained popular, but its cultural importance was diminishing. New music and variety shows emerged that better reflected changing tastes. The Sullivan Show was canceled in 1971 after 23 years on air, not because of poor ratings, but because CBS wanted programming that attracted younger, more affluent viewers. In his final years, as he battled the cancer that would claim his life in 1974, Sullivan became increasingly reflective about his legacy. It was during this period that he reportedly shared his personal list of the performers he had most disliked, a rare glimpse behind the controlled persona he had maintained for decades. The ultimate irony. The final irony of Ed Sullivan's career is that the very performers he most resisted are now considered pivotal figures in American cultural history. Elvis Presley is recognized as one of the most influential cultural forces of the 20th century. Buddy Holly is celebrated as a pioneering architect of rock and roll. Bob Dylan received the Nobel Prize in Literature. James Brown is revered as the godfather of soul. The Beatles are perhaps the most acclaimed band in popular music history, and the Doors left an indelible mark on rock music.